And now, a section most of you were probably waiting for, GitLab. Instead of me spending half an hour explaining everything GitLab can do, you should check GitLab's About page. We'll use small but important subset of its features, such as Git repository, private image registry, some of CI/CD stuff, and maybe another thing or two. Their Docker deployment documentation page explains a few different scenarios, but I'll go down the Docker Compose route with an additional .env file for variables. First, let's create the directories, and then open main.yml inside tasks subdirectory. We make sure that the services directory exists. We then copy GitLab directory to it, and then we create app and secrets directories. These will be used for backups, but more on that later. For now, note that I'm using user and group ID here, the same thing we did with Pi-hole. The user from inside GitLab container has user ID 998, and that user is the one who will need write access to this directory. Then we run GitLab using Docker Compose, and finally we add backup script to root's crontab. Save the file and open dockercompose.yml inside GitLab directory. We again have services at the top level, and this time it's GitLab. We then set container name and host name. We need to set up DNS A record for this domain too. In Linode console, click Add an A record. Hostname will be gitlab.dodhp.com. IP address will be public IP of the VPS. Set the TTL and click Save. We then set Docker image and image tag. We want to restart this container unless explicitly stopped. And for the ports section, let's jump quickly to the drawing. So when you type gitlab.dodhp.com in your browser, or you do a git clone over HTTPS protocol, you will connect on port 80 or 443. It will always end up on 443 because we have HTTPS redirect as traffic middleware. That connection ends up on the interface on the VPS, and because those ports are mapped by traffic, firewall forwards the connection to it. Traffic sees that you're asking for gitlab.dodhp.com, it recognizes the host, checks a service named GitLab, and lets you through. Finally, your request is served by Nginx inside the GitLab container. We must do the same thing for SSH protocol for when someone tries to clone a repository with git clone git add something. By default, this will try to use port 22, but we'll add an entry to .sshconfig file where we will tell it to use a custom port. Docker will then map port 44822 on the VPS to the port 22 inside the GitLab container. So when a connection comes on port 44822, firewall will route it directly to the GitLab container and your connection will be successful. So that's why we have this ports section here. We were only dealing with HTTP stuff up until now, which was handled by traffic and labels, but for SSH protocol we have to map it ourselves. In volumes, I'm adding directories I wish to persist even after the container is removed. Documentation mentions config, logs, and data, but I'm adding this one too so that during the backup, GitLab can save the tar archive directly on the VPS. It'll be clear after I talk about how GitLab performs backups. GitLab is also part of the Docker network named Web, then there are logging parameters, and then labels. I want to enable traffic for this container. I'm setting the Docker network name, host rule, TLS resolver, entry point. I'm giving this service a name. I'm telling traffic that the Nginx inside this container will listen on port 80, and I'm setting the IP whitelist middleware. The Docker registry part is mostly the same. The difference is registry is listening on port 5050. Important thing to note here is that because we'll run GitLab and image registry, traffic needs to handle two services. Services need to have unique names, so that's why there are two different variables here. One is called service registry and the other is called service GitLab. One thing they do share is the IP whitelist subnets. This environment section demands a little preface. GitLab has a configuration file called gitlab.rb, and it is GitLab's main configuration file. The way it works is that on a running GitLab instance, you would open this file, make any changes you need, save the file, and then restart GitLab so that those changes take effect. To avoid that dance, we'll do everything using this environment section so that GitLab is deployed with all those settings already in place. I think that only external URL is mandatory, but I also want to set the initial root password, otherwise you would have to go inside the container and read it from a file. I want support for large files enabled, and I want SMTP configured. You can experiment with the number of Puma workers based on how much CPUs your server has, and I usually disable Prometheus monitoring on weaker servers because it is a bit heavy on resources. Then there is the Nginx configuration, where I tell it that I want it to listen only on HTTP port 80 and not HTTPS, because TLS certificate is served by traffic. I'm setting the maximum upload file size, and I'm telling Nginx to trust connections from Docker subnets. These two are so that we see real client IP in GitLab logs, and not the IP of traffic. Without this, because traffic is the one accessing GitLab, you would see private IP of traffic container in GitLab's access logs. But with this, Nginx will read HTTP header x forwarded 4, which holds the IP of the user who initially made the request. And these last four are for GitLab's private image registry. This is where you can store the Docker images you create. It has its own port. We again force HTTP because of the TLS termination, and we need to configure DNS-A record for it too. In Linode console, add an A record. I'll call it gitlab-registry.do-p.com, public IP of the VPS, set the TTL, and click Save. Save the file and open .env file also in GitLab directory. There's nothing special in here. There are variables from Docker Compose and some for the backup script. Save the file and open backup.sh in GitLab subdirectory. This one is a bit different than others because GitLab has its own tool for creating backups in a safe manner. That is this GitLab backup create and GitLab CTL backup etc. The rest of the script should look familiar. There are some variables, deleting older backups and inserting results into the backups database. Save the file, open setup.yml, comment out previous roles, add role named GitLab, save the file and run Ansible again. Ansible has finished, and after a few minutes there will be two new services in Traffic's dashboard, GitLab and GitLab registry. If I go to the gitlab.do-p.com while connected with WireGuard, I'll see the welcome page. Username is root and password is the one you set in .env file. Don't be alarmed by this message here. Technically it is correct, but only those with WireGuard can access this page. You can turn free registrations off by clicking here and then unchecking sign up enabled, but unless you plan to remove the IP allow list middleware, I wouldn't worry too much about it. You can whitelist domains so that only people with certain mail addresses can sign up, and you can blacklist them. When you're done, save the changes. Let's create a new user. Click on this button here, go to admin area and click new user. Type in your name, your username. For mail, I'll use notifications@do-p.com, but you'll probably want to create a new personal mail address in iRedMail. I want to have administrator role. Scroll down and click create user. Check your inbox. There should be a new mail from GitLab. Click on the link and set your password. Now sign out from the root user. and sign in as the user you've just created. I now want to add my public SSH key to GitLab so that I can clone a repository through SSH protocol, which means that I can avoid messing with username and password and rely on SSH key. Click on your profile icon and then click Preferences. In the sidebar, click SSH keys, click Add new key, paste the public part of your SSH key. Here you can set a date when this key becomes invalid here in GitLab, which I don't want, and click Add key. To test that it works, we need to do two things: create a repository and edit our SSH config file. Click on the plus icon, click New Project Repository. I'll create a blank project. Project name will be test. I want it under my namespace. I want it to be private. I do want to initialize it with a README. Click Create Project. Next, I'll use this snippet to add an entry to the SSH config file. So for host gitlab.do-hp.com and user git, use port 44822. Go back to the GitLab UI. In the clone dropdown, copy the git link, go back to the terminal and type in git clone and then paste the link. Because this is the first time we are connecting to this host, we have to confirm that we are okay with it. Test repository was cloned successfully, and I can see the README file it was initialized with. I can now create a new file, then I can add it and commit it and push the changes. If I refresh the page in browser, I can see that the file was pushed successfully. Let's check the backup script. The MNT storage backups GitLab has app and secrets directories created by Ansible, and we can see that it has permissions we have defined. We can run the backup script from services GitLab directory. Script has finished, and GitLab/app now has a tar archive which contains stuff like Git repository data, GitLab pages content, container registry images, and so on. What it doesn't contain are files and directories from etc GitLab, TLS keys, certificates, and other secret stuff. Those are stored here in secrets directory. To restore GitLab, you need files from both directories. The last thing on the slide is GitLab's container registry, but we'll deal with that later, after we deploy GitLab Runner and create a Python application which will Dockerize.